Hi, everyone. Joining us today is a man who wrote columns and stories about the sports broadcasting business for two Los Angeles newspapers. He did it for 8.5 years for the Herald Examiner and for 30, well, make it 26 years with the Times. He's just written a book about his interesting career and the people he covered. It's a pleasure to welcome Larry Stewart. How are you, Larry?
Ross, hey, it's a privilege to be with you. We do, I guess, since we're both old, we go back a long ways.
Yes, we do.
Well, your KNBC days.
The book is titled My Up Close View, Personal Stories from a
Here, I'll hold it up too.
Sports, TV, radio columnist. There it is. And it covers a period from 1973 to 2007. One of America's prominent sportscasters, Jim Nantz, who has worked for CBS the last 37 years, wrote the longest foreword to a book I think I've ever seen, 4 pages.
Yeah.
In his last paragraph, Nantz writes, as you will experience in this book, Larry is not only a gifted storyteller, but also someone who found himself in the middle of some fascinating escapades. Larry has built and nurtured friendships with many of the biggest stars in sports. I consider it an honor to have had Larry critique and report on my career. I trust you will enjoy the many behind-the-scenes stories from a remarkable reporter. Very nicely said.
Oh, it was a beautiful forward. The story behind that was Jim was among many people who really encouraged me to write the book. And he gives me credit for a column I wrote that led to him doing a book that became a New York Times bestseller. So he was really pushing me, do it, and along with a number of other people. Barbara Zuwanich, who I worked with at the Herald Examiner, is another one. But I said, well, Jim, if I write it, will you do the forward? And it was sort of forward of me to ask him to write the forward. But that was the way the conversation went. And he said, absolutely. So I sent him a manuscript before it was fully edited, but it gave him the gist of the book. And a couple of weeks go by and I thought, I wonder if he forgot to do the forward. A couple more weeks go by. And when I finally got the forward, I realized he had read the entire book and spent a lot of time compiling that forward. He just didn't take, okay, I'll bat something off the top of my head about Larry Stewart, do a page, and there you go. Yeah. So can't thank him enough for that.
Larry, I learned so much about my colleagues and friends reading this book, which has 309 pages. You said you started the book 10 years ago, but you didn't really put the time into it until the COVID-19 scare 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. I was looking for something to do, like a lot of us. And I thought, why don't I, again, Jim Nantz and some other friends were still saying, write that book, right? You got the time now. And so that kind of inspired me. And you played a small role in this, Ross.
Yes.
Well, I was going through old clippings and I have some scrapbooks and stacks of clippings along with letters like we all do. And I found a column that I had written for the Herald Examiner in 1976, and it was on Bryant Gumbel.
Wow.
So I have maintained a relationship with Bryant. And so I scanned it and sent it to him. And known Bryant for a long time. He went through his young, cocky stage, but he's really turned into a really nice man.
Yeah.
And he read the column and he says, Ross sure had something nice to say about me. Oh boy, I was pretty cocky, wet behind the ears, 26-year-old when I worked with Ross. So he really appreciated that quote. And I think you did share an email. But Bryant was another one who encouraged me to go ahead and write the book. But your small role was that your quote in that 1976 column on Bryant Gumbel.
Thank you so much. And you told me after you did that that Bryant said, I don't know if Ross is still alive, but I still appreciate what he did to help me when I got started.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had a
I think he did.
fantastic career, and you knew right off the bat, Larry, he was going to be very, very outstanding in his field for what he could do. And he was a Russian major at Bates College in Maine, got into a sports writing job, and then they got him out to LA and said, try television. He did that. And the funny thing is, he told me that one day some executive in New York called him from NBC and said, Ryan, I want to ask you something. Do you have a brother? He said, well, yeah. He said, does he know anything about sports? Well, he said, yeah. He said, what's he doing? Well, he's selling some sort of pharmaceutical supplies in Cleveland. So he said, do you think we could get a hold of him? He said, yeah. They called him, and Greg Gumbel took on a job that then let him in the network. And it was an outstanding, it was just a great story, I thought.
That is a great story, which I didn't know. That is very, very, I knew Greg. Greg was really nice, but even he complained about Bryant, in the middle of his career when he was on the Today Show, and people were complaining he was pretty cocky, but I don't see any of that now.
No.
Bryant, when I email him, he emails me back and is always pleasant.
Yeah.
And
so we had a nice exchange after you set that up, and I got the same idea. In fact, he said to me, I'm not doing any interviews anymore. I don't need to do that. And why take that on and maybe get myself into trouble, which I thought was interesting. Let's have a little background on you, Larry. You grew up in California, San Joaquin Valley, farming area. You graduated from Fresno State. You wanted to be a sports writer, and you worked on several small newspapers before you came to Los Angeles. And I want to share some things out of your book that I thought were just outstanding, and people would really be pleased to see it. And let me start out with this one. And of course, we're talking about,
right here.
I think, the two most loved sports personalities in Los Angeles history, and you write how they met. You said, Vin Scully said, when the Dodgers moved to LA in 1958, owner Walter O'Malley rented him and his wife an apartment in Brentwood. A few days after moving in, Scully walked to a grocery store and returned carrying 2 bags filled to the brim. When I reached our apartment building, Scully said, a gentleman appeared out of nowhere and opened the gate from the wrought iron fence. The gentleman also offered to help me with my groceries, so I handed him one of the bags. After we set the bags down in my apartment, the man who told me he lived in the same building asked if we were new to the area. I said we were. I introduced myself and explained I was an announcer for the Dodgers who had just moved here from Brooklyn. The man said he was a baseball fan and fully aware of that. He then introduced himself, saying, my name is John Wooden, and I coach basketball over at the nearby university, UCLA. That is how we met. And you said I called Wooden to get his version, and it was pretty much the same. It made for great fodder for my next TV radio column. A Times copy editor handling that column called me over to his desk and said, is this for real? I said, I assured him it was.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite anecdotes too, Ross. So it was amazing. Here are these two legends met by accident and lived in the same apartment building.
Yeah. And you know, Larry, I think as well as I do, that John Wooden, who most people know had 7 consecutive national collegiate basketball champions at UCLA and won 10 in 12 years. He's always said that his favorite sport was baseball.
Yeah, I know that. There was Bob Hunter, the legendary Dodger writer of years past, threw a party when Alan Malamud and I were named sports editor and assistant sports editor of the Herald Examiner in 1974. And Bob Hunter, who knew everybody, invited everybody who was anybody in the sports scene. And John Wooden was there. Bob Boyd, his adversary from USC, was there. I couldn't name everybody, but what I recall was Wooden spent most of the night huddled up with Pepper is it Pepper Gomez I'm thinking
No,
of?
Lefty Gomez.
Lefty Gomez. I knew I had that name wrong.
Well,
Just talking baseball.
Pedro was a baseball writer who just passed away recently. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so another thing is Wooden carried around a clipping in his wallet. My wife and I had several dinners with him, and he pulled it out of his wallet. And it was just a short story in the Pittsburgh Gazette from years before when, and I think the owner, was it Joe E. Brown owned the Pittsburgh Pirates?
Joe E. Brown. He was the general manager too.
And they're the general manager, and he had offered Wooden the job of managing the Pirates.
Wow.
Of course, Wooden declined, but he was very proud of that clipping, so of all the things he could keep in his wallet, he got a baseball managerial job offer.
Yeah. Larry, you and your wife, Norma, had quite a few dinners with Coach Wooden, and there is Norma, who you've been married to almost 50 years with the coach. And again, I want to go back to your book. You said, I considered legendary UCLA basketball coach John Wooden a friend too. Late in his life, my wife Norma and I had several dinners with him and his daughter Nan. Our last meal with those two was at the Bistro Garden restaurant in Studio City when Wooden was 98 and in a wheelchair. He had to be lifted into my car when we picked them up at Coach's condo in Encino. Later in the evening, when we were leaving the restaurant, the valet was helping Nan and me get her father into my car. I realized I was $1 short for a sufficient tip and asked my wife for the dollar. Wooden, while hanging on to a handle above the passenger seat, motioned for us to stop. He pulled out a money clip from a pocket, peeled off a dollar bill, and called Norma over to the car. Norma, this is for you, he said, as he handed her the dollar bill. And then he said, a lady should never have to pay. And you wrote, a true old school gentleman.
Ross, you picked out two of my favorite anecdotes.
Oh, good.
From the whole, I think that's where both of those were high up in the book. So I tried to balance. I think some of my best stories are toward the end. It's not like a newspaper story where you make the lead to grab people and then it goes from the most important things on down. I tried to space out the anecdotes, and I think there's just as many toward the end of the book as there were in the first few chapters.
Yeah, well, those were wonderful stories. I want to go back a little bit and see if this is similar to your situation. In 1966, I left Oklahoma City to come to LA and be the weekend sports anchor at Channel 4 KNBC. And when friends asked me why, I said, Los Angeles is the sports capital of the world. They have the Dodgers, they have the Rams, they have the Lakers, they have the Angels, they have USC, UCLA. Boy, was I excited. You arrived here 3 years later. Did you have the same feeling as I had about coming to Los Angeles?
Maybe even more so, because I was a Californian. And when I was a youngster, I lived in this town called Strathmore that's near Porterville and not too far from Visalia in Tulare County. My parents had a 20-acre orange grove, not a lot of money. The town had one intersection. At that time, when I was young, it didn't even have a stoplight. I believe it does now. But so I come from a humble background, and I was like so many other young boys back then. When the Dodgers moved to Los Angeles in 1958, suddenly I could get Dodger games, Dodger broadcasts on 50,000 watt KFI, which at nighttime boomed through much of California. And so I was like so many Southern Californians, even though I wasn't a Southern Californian. I went to sleep at night with that transistor radio right next to my ear, listening to Vin Scully, never dreaming that I would ever get to meet him, let alone have a relationship with him.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well,
maybe you thought the same thing. Did you ever think that you would partner up with Vin Scully when you came to Los Angeles?
No,
He probably wasn't have the same stature in Oklahoma that he did throughout California.
that's absolutely right. And the first time I met him, he came to Channel 4 to appear on some show, and he was in the makeup room when I went down to get my makeup for the news that night. And we had a nice chat at that time. And of course, he's such a wonderful man. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again today, Larry. I was with Vin Scully 28 years. I saw him every situation he could possibly be put into. People stopping him, asking him for autographs, asking him for pictures, telling him stories about how he must have remembered a game between Brooklyn and Boston back in the 50s, because he was at that game with his grandfather. And Vin was always so nice to those people and just listened to the stories. He might have been very close to going on the air, but he didn't rush it. And my point is this: in 28 years with Vin Scully, I never saw him rude to one person. And I think that says it all.
I witnessed that, Ross. He came to one of my charity golf tournaments at Angeles Crest. I believe the year was 2011. And I kind of was looking over, making sure everything goes okay. He was supposed to come for an hour and showed up a half an hour early.
Yeah.
And so people in line would come up and tell him, then when I was a kid, I used to go to sleep at night listening to you on my transistor radio.
Yeah.
And Vin would say, oh, what a marvelous story. I sure appreciate you saying that. The next person in line, then when I was a kid, I'd have a transistor radio next to my ear. And Vin would, like he'd never heard that before. Oh. He would say, wow, I really appreciate that's a marvelous story. Another thing with charity things, I used to bring people to Dodger games and try and slip them into the broadcast booth to meet Vin. And for a while, I just blindside him, hey, Vin, could you meet some people? And he'd come, gee, Larry, gosh, we got to do this. We got to do that. Maybe for just a minute, and the people would come in and, hi, how are you? And he'd spend 10 minutes taking pictures and making sure we had the right lighting for the picture. Right. And he was marvelous with fans.
Yeah, outstanding. In your words, the best part of my job was not writing. That was work. The best part was dealing with people. I needed to cultivate sources to do my job, which meant socializing with sources. Very important to you, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were people that thought if I was simply a critic, I should not talk to my sources, people that I was criticizing. But I was in somewhat of an awkward position where I was expected to say somebody did a good job or was not doing a good job for whatever reasons. And oftentimes I would know that person and have to deal with them later. I had more than a few uncomfortable phone calls over the year. But I kind of learned to deal with that. I never tried to add fuel to the fire. To continue that quote about it was the best part of my job with dealing with people. I think I continued on to say, and the worst part of my job was dealing with people. It depended on the person. Now, there were times when I had to criticize somebody that I personally liked and vice versa. There was times when I actually praised people that I really didn't care for that much.
Who's been your favorite person to interview?
Well, for years, people used to ask me that. And it turned out to be Charles Barkley, which I lead with in the book.
I knew you were going to say that. Let me throw something in here. For anybody who doesn't know who Charles Barkley is, he was an 11-time NBA All-Star, a college and pro basketball Hall of Famer, won 2 Olympic gold medals. Then he became an NBA analyst, 4 Sports Emmy Awards, still really at the top of his game. And you have ridden in a number of limousines with Charles over the years. Tell us about the night you were on the way to the NBC studios in Burbank, where he was to appear on the Tonight Show with Jay Leno.
Well, this is my lead to the book in chapter 1. And I was looking for an anecdote that would appeal to all people. Everybody knows about crowded freeways and having a flat tire on the freeway. Well, this is what happened when I was riding in a limo with Charles. Greg Hughes was a PR guy for TNT. He's now head of PR for NBC Sports. Great guy, great publicist. He came up with the idea when Charles first started at TNT and he came out to be on with Jay Leno. He checked with Charles and says, hey, why don't you ride with us to the show, to NBC, your old haunt? And I said, yeah, that sounds great. I didn't know what to expect. You know, Charles had some incidents in his life that got a lot of publicity. So I wasn't sure, you know, what to expect, but he turned out to be just a gem of a person. And the first time I did a ride along is when there was a lot of rumors about him and Michael Jordan returning to the NBA. And I asked him about it on the way to the Leno show, and he told me the whole thing. Then he said the words that all journalists hate: this is all off the record. And so, but, and then Jay, on TV during the show, Jay asked him about it and asked him who called who. And he kind of said, well, Michael called me. And then Jay went on to other things. And so when we got back in the limo, I said, Charles, you just announced on TV that Jordan called you. I think what you told me before is no longer off the record. And he says, yeah, Michael's going to kill me anyway. Go ahead and write it. And then he gave me the whole, filled in all the blanks for a national exclusive. Yeah. But the time we had the flat tire was 2 or 3. I probably did at least a half a dozen what we called ride-alongs with Charles, and always got a great column out of it.
Tell about the one.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the time. This was the second or third time we're almost to NBC. We're getting right to the Buena Vista off-ramp. And all of a sudden the limo starts swaying back and forth. And Greg Hughes is in the limo, said, or Charles goes, I think we just blew a tire. And Greg Hughes says, Charles, I've told you need to lose weight. And he laughed. But the interesting thing about, not only was it funny because eventually Charles and I got out of the limo and I'm standing next to him watching the looky-loos go by thinking, what in the world? Is that Charles Barkley? Who's that little guy next to him? You know, so we got a kick out of looking at these people going by. But the interesting thing, Ross, was Charles was having fun with this. Most people would have said, I'm going to be on national TV. I've got to get there. This is ridiculous, because nobody from NBC came. Nobody from the Auto Club came. We're sitting there for a half an hour and most people would be going nuts. And Charles is just having a great time. And finally, the limo driver changed the tire. And I think Charles slipped him probably a pretty good tip for that.
Yeah.
And we got to the NBC just before Jay was going on the air. Jay usually liked to come in with his guests and spend some time and talk to them in the dressing room.
Yeah.
But there was no time. Jay stuck his head in the, Charles, sorry, we're going on in 2 minutes. Charles said, no problem. So as soon as it was Charles' turn to come on, Charles just nailed Jay. Says, NBC sent a limo to pick me up and it had a flat tire over here and nobody came to our rescue. The poor driver had to change the tire. What kind of operation you running here, Jay? So anyway, because everybody can identify, as I said, with the flat tire and standing on the side of the freeway, that was my lead anecdote to just kind of grab people's attention. And then I went on to say I had a lot of great experiences because I was a sports TV columnist for so long.
Yeah, that's great. Well, one of your least favorite sports announcers was Howard Cosell. In fact, in your book, you referred to him as a jerk. Cosell, who spent 32 of his 40 years in the business with ABC, once said of himself, I've been called arrogant, pompous, obnoxious, vain, cruel, verbose, a show-off. And of course, I am. How many occasions did he give you a bad time?
It was up and down with Howard. It depended on his mood. It was almost like a caricature of a person who was obnoxious. He was so obnoxious, you just couldn't believe that this guy, I don't think he could have gotten away with acting the way he did if he wasn't a celebrity. And a celebrity he was. He was recognized everywhere he went. And my first meeting with him, I'd done a phone interview a few months earlier in December of 1973. I'm 26 years old. And there was a Monday night football game, the Rams and the New York Giants at the Coliseum. And there was a luncheon at the Hollywood Palladium that I went to. And that's when I went up and I introduced myself to Howard. And my colleague, Barbara Zuanich, was with me, was a very attractive 29-year-old woman. And he's like, he flirts with her and he's telling us how sick he is. And finally, Barbara says to Howard, well, are you going to be able to go on the air tonight? And he told her, he said, no, I'll just let those other two guys handle it. And then the Herald was an afternoon paper. I still had at least one more edition coming out that afternoon. I thought I could call the paper, get something in that Howard was sick and wasn't going to work the game. So I said, Howard, are you serious? And that set him off. How could I possibly be serious? How could they do Monday night football without me? Are you just an immature little baby? And he went on from there. He said, I'd read the column, and he just blasted me. And he pulled a letter out of his coat pocket that some professor had written to him about the corrupt print business and the sports writers. And finally I said, Howard, I'm not going to get into a verbal confrontation with you. I mean, I couldn't win that one. Oh. And I started to walk away, and he said, come back here, young man. I'm not done with you yet. So anyway, I had a number of run-ins with Howard over the years, and sometimes he was okay. One time we're at somebody's house, and he asked me to play pool with him, but then a crowd gathered and I never got a shot. He wanted to show off what a good pool player he is. But I did get the scoop of my career that he was quitting Monday Night Football in 1984. Right a few days before the Olympics started, I was hanging out at the ABC Hotel doing some interviews and so forth. And I ran into my beloved colleague, Jim Murray. And he said, Larry, I just had dinner with Howard Cosell, and we were talking about you. And Jim Murray is one of the few sports writers that Howard actually liked. Yeah. And I think Jim had led him to believe I'd done a very positive column about whether he should retire or not. In truth, it was probably balanced, to be fair about it. It was probably balanced, it wasn't. But I said, well, where is Howard now? And he says, well, he went over to the bar. Of course, he liked to have his vodkas on the rocks with a twist. And I says, well, maybe I'll go look for him. And Jim says, well, I'll help you. And so the two of us walked over and found him at a little table with several ABC people, including Mike Ruzioni. And so this is about 9 o'clock at night. I left at 1:30. So I'm working him the whole night, stroking his ego, trying to get him to tell me he's going to quit. And he finally told me when to call him in his office. And I did on the Monday after, not right after the Olympics, but it was about a week after the Olympics on a Monday. I called his office. His assistant said he's on vacation. He's at his summer home in the Hamptons in West Hampton. And so I gave her the number. He didn't call. I called back the next day because somebody says he's pretty sure he's going to retire. So when I called the next day, I told the assistant, it's very important I get a hold of Howard. And so I was home. It was during the day. And I waited and I waited. And finally I said, well, I'll go for my morning jog. And I got 200 yards from my house. And I thought, what am I doing? What if he calls? I was back in my house for like 5 minutes. And he didn't identify himself when he called. He didn't say, is this Larry Stewart? I said, hello. And he goes, Larry Stewart, how are you and Mike Ruzioni getting along these days? Why he said that, Mike Ruzioni had spent people were in and out during all that time at the little cocktail table at the Hilton Hotel. But Mike Ruzioni was there for at least an hour, if not closer to 2 hours. But I criticized Mike. I'd actually criticized ABC during the Olympics for the role that they had Mike Eruzione in doing funny pieces about LA. And that wasn't his forte. He was a hockey hero, the captain of the 1980 Olympic team. So, but I'll always remember, so that was his jockocracy. He didn't like the networks hiring jocks just because they had a name.
Yeah.
So that's why I'll always remember, how are you and Mike Eruzione getting along? Then I followed it up and with a little chit chat and says, I understand you're going to be retiring. And he gave me the whole story. And he spent about 2.5 pages in his book claiming he had inadvertently given me a national exclusive.
Yeah.
He didn't tell it like it is in his book.
He had 14 years on Monday Night Football, 1970 to 1983. So that was a great scoop for you. Larry Stewart's our guest. He was one of the first newspaper columnists in the country to cover sports broadcasting. And he's got a new book, My Up Close View, which is a great read. I can tell you that.
I'll hold it up.
I did it. You wrote that Vin Scully, Chick Hearn, and Bob Miller are generally recognized as the 3 greatest Los Angeles play-by-play announcers of all time. No disagreement here whatsoever about that. And when you talk about each one of them, you wrote that when Vin joined CBS in 1975, he was ready to leave the Dodgers. How did you know that?
Vin told me. Vin was good to reporters. I had a good at that, particularly then, and I was at the Herald Examiner, so we had a good relationship. I could just call him at any time, and he would return my call or pick up the phone. And he told me that, and I think it was a scoop. I imagine nobody else. There was no other sports TV columnist at that time, that he was not leaving the Dodgers, that Peter O'Malley, and he gave total credit to Peter, had said, Vin, how about you stay on and just do the games you can? Otherwise, Vin would have been gone and we wouldn't be talking about him in the same way that we are now, because he spent, was it 68 years?
He stayed 41 more years after that.
41 more years, but total it was 68, right?
He retired after his 67th season.
67th, yeah. And so Peter gets a lot of credit for coming up with that.
Yeah.
And same thing. Then in 1983, he left CBS, where he did football and golf, to do baseball for NBC. And again, he went to Peter and he goes, same deal, just do the games you can. And, it worked out for everybody.
Sure did. Chick Hearn broadcast Lakers games for 41 seasons. He earned his nickname Chick while playing college basketball at Bradley University. Teammates played a prank on him one day. They gave him a shoebox to see his surprised reaction when he opened it and found not sneakers inside, but instead a dead chicken. Now, you and Chick's wife, Marge, who lived to be 98, attempted to have him give you a scoop on his retirement. Tell that story.
Well, I mentioned my friendship with Bill Sharman, who is from Porterville, which Porterville was 6 miles from Strathmore, my hometown. So I first talked to Bill on the phone when he was the coach of the LA Stars of the ABA in 1969-70. And he had to call the Herald Examiner and the Times after games to make sure we got the box score and give us some quotes and some details on the game. Not the PR guy, this was the coach. So it's my second or third night at the Herald Examiner, and suddenly I pick up the phone. This is Bill Sharman from he hadn't lost his voice at that point. And he said, this is Bill Sharman from the LA Stars. And I go, I was tongue-tied. And I go, oh, this is quite an honor, Mr. Sharman. I'm from Strathmore. Strathmore. So we became, good, very good friends. And so I would go in later years at Staples Center. Bill and I talked 2 or 3 times a week, played golf a lot. And he didn't invite me to play golf because of my golf game. We were just good friends. We liked each other.
That's right.
It didn't matter that he was a celebrity and I was just, it was just, we were truly really good friends. Maybe my second father, you might say.
Oh.
So I would sit with Bill Sharman at Staples Center, and he was in row 11, and Marge was about 2 rows behind us. One time, she was sitting by herself. I guess whoever she was supposed to sit with couldn't make it, and Bill actually needed the seat next to him, so I went and sat with Marge. And during that time, we came up with this scheme. She really wanted Chick to retire. And I said, if he announced his retirement, that next year would be his last. He'd be honored in every NBA stadium in the country. He'd get the goodbye tour. And she said, I know, Larry. I don't know how we can talk him into it. So our plan was that she would tell Chick I would be coming over to the house to do an interview. And that's when I could get out the plan. Chick, why don't you announce your retirement? And then you'd be honored throughout the country the next year. I would get a scoop. Marge would get her wish. So I get over to their house. I left the office downtown, maybe 3 o'clock to kind of beat the rush hour. It still had some traffic, but I get there, I can't remember, but probably pretty close to 4. And an advantage a print reporter has, we can make small talk for a while before we get down to the meaty questions the questions we really want to ask. And not like broadcasters, you go on the air, you can't just do chit chat. So we do some small talk, and finally I say, Chick, you thought about maybe just announcing that next season will be your last? And he says, Larry, you've been talking to Marge, haven't you? and that was that. One more story about Marge along the same line was after Chick had passed in 2002. It was maybe a year later. I used to go to some Pasadena Quarterback Club luncheons at Brookside, adjacent to the Rose Bowl. And my friend Harvey Hyde was helping lining up programs. And he said, Larry, could you help me? We'd like to honor Keith Jackson and Chick emeritusly and get Marge, his wife, to come and accept the award. And he said, we'll get cars for each person. And I told Harvey, you only need one car. They're neighbors. One lives on Mulholland off the 405 to the west, and Keith is off the 405 at Mulholland to the east. By the crow flies, they were probably maybe 2, at the most 3 miles apart. So they weren't next door neighbors, but by LA standards, they were neighbors. So they both came in one car to the luncheon, and Marge is the first to speak. And she says, Keith, I'd never met you before. I just found out we were neighbors. And then she said, but your name used to get mentioned at our house a lot. And then she pointed down at me from the dais in the crowd and said, Larry wrote in his column one time, several years ago, asked you about retiring. And you said, and Marge had the quote down perfect. And you said, well, look at Vin Scully. He's just going to go on forever. As far as Chick Hearn's concerned, somebody's going to have to shoot him. So Marge says, every time I'd get upset with Chick, I'd say, Keith Jackson's right. I'm going to have to shoot you. And that showed me, along with a number of other things, Chick got a lot of his wit from Marge.
Oh, yeah.
He was a witty, fun person. My wife and I used to take her out and get together with her. One time I called her and she said, Larry, I'm 96 years old or 95, whatever it was. She says, I just don't go out anymore. I just can't. And it was too bad, but she lived a long, interesting life.
Yeah. He was named Francis Dale Hearn, and Marge called him Francis a lot of the time, didn't he?
You know, I was surprised. The only time I ever heard her refer to him as Chick is when she told that story that I just told. So it stuck out that she said, so whenever I'd get upset with Chick, and when she said that, I'd never heard her refer to him as Chick before. I think she did it for the audience, because if she said Francis, people might think, who's that?
Bob Miller is another Hall of Famer, having aired Kings hockey games for 44 seasons. He had to wait 39 years to see the team win his first Stanley Cup. They captured another one 2 years later. And in your book, Larry, you say that Bob and Bill Sharman are probably the nicest sports figures you ever interviewed.
Nope, that's exactly right. You know, one time I was with at John Wooden's condo, and we were waiting for Bill. Bill and Sharman and John Wooden had really liked each other and really respected each other. They knew each other pretty well. And so Bill was driving up from Palos Verdes, and I was already at Wooden's, and I mentioned to John Wooden, we had a mutual friend named Denny Ryan. And I said to the coach, I said, Denny Ryan and Bill Sharman are probably the two nicest people in the world. And the coach said, I would agree with that assessment. So, yeah, the coach and I felt the same about Bill Sharman. And I think anybody that knew him would feel that way. And I don't like the way Bill Sharman is being portrayed on this HBO show, Winning Times. And if I was Jerry West, I'd be furious. It's just, I don't know if you've seen that series that's going on in HBO, Winning Times, but I'll just say I'm not pleased with that show.
What about Bob Miller? Did you have much with Bob Miller interviewed wise?
I probably didn't interview him enough because hockey just didn't, the Kings weren't winning championships like the Dodgers and the Lakers were. And hockey the Kings established themselves in 2012 and 2014. Well, I was no longer doing my column. So, but Bob Miller was more of a friend. And then we were involved in Southern California sports broadcasters. Yeah. Bob asked me to do the newsletter for the organization around 2010. And later I became a board member, and he stepped down and Chris Roberts took over. So Bob Miller was more of a friend than somebody I interviewed a lot. Right. I read his book before I did mine. His was filled with anecdotes and stories. Yes. And mine was kind of the same format. We had lunch the other day, and I said, well, I'm not a big enough name to get an advance on a book. I said, what did you get an advance? And he goes, I only got 200,000. And I almost fell off my chair. And then he started laughing. He said, no, I think I got 2,500.
Larry, I think hockey is the toughest sport for a play-by-play announcer. And Bob was a master of it.
I'm not that big a hockey fan, but I was when they were winning those Stanley Cups. I was watching every game. And of course, he wasn't on the air because the network announcers take over. Yeah. And but I just have so many friends that are big hockey fans that say he was the best. He was absolutely the best. And he studied like you did before Dodger games. He was known. I mean, he had to get the pronunciation of all those French names and the foreigners' names. In baseball, you didn't have the strange names that he did in hockey.
And for him to have to change with those lines being changed every 2 or 3 minutes and new players out there. I mean, I don't know how he did it.
But he was, before he came to do the Kings, he did Wisconsin football and basketball. Yeah. And wrestling, I think. So he could have done any sport and he would have been as revered doing those sports, but he liked hockey. He liked he liked the players, the organization, and he stuck with it, you know, and it paid off for him because he now has a statue in front of Staples Center.
Yes, he does, yeah. Larry, one thing I noticed in your book was the many times you played a round of golf with celebrities and came away maybe with a story, but more likely because of friendship.
Yeah, nobody played golf with me because I was a good golfer, trust me. But I learned early on, Ross, I know you have your charity tournament. Do you golf much? Have you ever?
I haven't golfed in 5 or 6 years. We have a tournament for our son's nonprofit charity, Still Point Family Resources. And we've had that tournament now for 15 years. And I'm proud to say we've had 97 different celebrities participate, either play, come to lunch, come to dinner. And I could not be more proud of it. And we couldn't be more proud, my wife Lynn and I, of our son, because they are doing a marvelous job. And the whole focus on helping special needs, not only adults, but children, of course. And I know you've been very active too in helping with your charities.
Yeah, I found that I could help out with suggestions, but mainly getting celebrities to tournaments and auction items from the various teams. The Lakers have been just absolutely marvelous. I usually deal with Linda Rambis, or I was dealing with Jeannie Buss too, but now that she's moved up in stature, I kind of leave her alone, and I find that Linda Rambis is my go-to person. Yeah. And you know, one thing I'll just quickly say, one of my celebrities came to one of my golf tournaments that help foster care kids that are going to college after they age out at 18. And James Worthy came one year, and he was so tremendous. He came back they said, come back the next year.
Yeah, same with us.
And so we auctioned off a lunch with James and for $5,000, and everything was going. And James called about a week ahead of time and said, Larry, I've got a problem. I made a commitment to Ross Porter. And I said, oh, geez. And he says, I have to stick with that commitment. And he says, I can't do the lunch on the Monday that he was supposed to go to. These were several lawyers had chipped in, and the lunch was going to be at their office in Century City. But James says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take a night off of broadcasting. I'll set up in the Spectrum suite, which is A-level, the wide one, center court. I'll set up free drinks. I will entertain them. I said, James, that's absolutely tremendous.
Yeah.
So I call the lawyer, hey, James can't make it on Monday, but I've got great news. Well, lawyers can be kind of difficult sometimes. Well, we've already ordered a caterer and getting this thing set up again. I don't think we can do that, Larry. And the guy all but hung up on me. Oh. And I said, James, just go ahead, do your thing. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, we got through that. There was some restructuring of this charity since then, but I won't get into that now. No. You'll learn more about this charity later on. So
you played a lot of golf with Keith Jackson, and Keith was an excellent golfer. I think in the book you said when he was 67 years old, he shot 67 one day on the course.
Yeah, that was the South course at LA Country Club. There's an interesting story about Keith. A number of broadcasters would call and say, hey, you want to play golf? And thinking that hey, I'll kiss up to Larry Stewart, he'll write a nice column about me or something. Yeah. And I kind of had a personal rule. I play golf with you, but if you start working me, I'm not going to play with you again.
Wow.
You know, that we're out there to get to know each other a little better and have some fun.
Yeah.
And I won't name them, but a couple of guys worked me, and that was okay. I'm not playing with that person again. Let me tell you about Keith. Keith and I never played golf together until I was no longer at the Times, not doing the TV column. I would say it was 2011, 2012. And we weren't, I wasn't close to him like Bob Miller or even you or Vin or Chick. Knew Keith pretty well and had been up to his house to interview him, but I wouldn't say he could kind of be a curmudgeon.
Yeah, you could.
At times. He had that little like Chick. He was crusty on the outside, but kind of mush in the middle.
Great
So
heart.
one day I get a call. I didn't even know he had my home number. Larry, you want to play LA Country Club tomorrow? And yeah, sure. Well, Norma thought I get off the phone. Well, I'm playing golf with Keith Jackson tomorrow at LA Country Club. And she said something like, well, weren't we going to go shopping? And I go, no, playing golf with Keith Jackson wins out over shopping. But he kind of explained to me, he didn't think it would be appropriate to solicit me or, try and kiss up to me by taking me out to golf.
Yeah.
If he wanted to play. So we played several times after that and became friends.
Yeah.
And I would go up and visit him. He had dementia pretty bad toward the end. But I'd still go up and listen to his stories. And his wife, Turi Ann, is one of the nicest people.
Yes.
She is Bill Sharman, Bob Miller nice.
Yes.
She is just a super lady. One time I was up interviewing him. The one time I went up to his house and Turi Ann says, Keith, the phone's not ringing. And said, did you turn it off? And he said, yep. So I knew I had his total attention. But the one time I went up there, he first told me he didn't want to do the interview. And I said, this is before he announced his, he retired twice.
Yeah.
He retired once, came back, retired again.
Yeah.
So they were making a big thing out of his retirement. And I said, I'd really love to come up to your house and do an in-person interview. No, didn't want to do that. Just had this and that and going on and doing too much of this stuff. And I finally asked if I could take a photographer or send a photographer. And he said, I guess that'd be all right. And I said, well, and I called him back. I said, I'm going to need to come with the photographer. And he's, well, yeah, I guess that's okay. So the photographer and I arrived separately, but at the same time, just coincidentally, at about 11:30. And so now remember, he didn't want me to come up there. Yeah. This is 11:30 that at 4:30, he's opening up a second bottle of wine. Larry, where are you going? I said, Keith, I don't need another glass of wine. I've got to get home. But yeah, he was an interesting character.
Yeah. Larry, I have not brought up my working relationship with you. When you became a sports TV radio columnist in Los Angeles, I had 3 years left on Channel 4 and then 28 seasons with the Dodgers. In my mind, you were always fair to me in your column. I remember one time you rated me as the second best baseball announcer in Los Angeles behind, of course, the greatest ever, Mr. Scully. And that was very nice of you. And did you ever write anything critical, which I deserved? I'm not quite sure, but
probably. The only guy that I think in my book, I told you about the time Bob Costas wanted to have dinner with me, and he could recite every negative thing I ever wrote about him.
Oh, no.
And I said, but I wrote some positive things too. And then he recited those too.
Oh,
but,
wow.
I always liked you, Ross. I thought you got a raw deal with the Dodgers, and you dealt with me in a very professional way through all that. And I always really appreciated that.
Well, in your book, my name appears several times. And on page 28, I want to tell the story because I want to get this out.
I know the story, and I'm glad you're going to tell it.
All right, here it is. He said, Vin Scully, throughout the long career with the Dodgers, worked solo. He was taught to do it that way by his mentor, Red Barber, and always said he preferred talking directly to his audience, not a commentator. Scully was steadfast against a two-announcer format on Dodger broadcasts. Then you wrote, years later, I learned that in 1988, Dodger announcers Ross Porter and Don Drysdale, on their own, decided to work a spring training telecast as a two-man team. After that, they were called into Peter O'Malley's office and told to never do that again. They assumed Scully had complained. Well, Larry had sent me a copy of his book, friends, and when I read page 28, I called him and I said, I'm not mad. I know there's nothing that can be done about it now to correct it, but I want you to know the true facts. Don's first broadcast with the Dodgers was on radio, not television. It was the first game of spring training in 1988. We were in Vero Beach. And shortly before we went on the air, Don turned to me and said, I have always worked a two-man booth, and I like that. I've always exchanged comments with another announcer. Would it be okay if we did that? I said, hey, Don, it's fine with me. I've always had a color man on the NFL games on NBC. I've had color men for many, many college basketball games I have done. So the game begins. Don is doing the play-by-play. First inning, first broadcast with the Dodgers. And at some point in the top of the opening inning, he turned to me and either asked me a question or brought me on the air. When the half inning ended, the phone rang in our booth. Don was told, Peter O'Malley wants to speak to you. Peter said to him, we don't do two men on the air and only one voice do we have. Don hung up the phone and he was angry. He had a conversation with Peter after the game. Peter, though, never said a word to me about it. I was not called into his office, and Don and I never discussed then complaining. And Larry told me, to his credit, he was glad to know the true story. And if he decided to republish the book, he would make a necessary change. I thank you for that.
And I did change it around. I couldn't get into the in-depth that you just provided, but my source for that was Don Drysdale.
Was it?
Yeah. You know where I got that story. So he embellished it a little bit, but he complained quite a bit to me about he was not getting hardly any airtime at all. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to be Scully's commentator. And so I listened to him. And so finally, in the small type, I had a sentence, something along those lines. And the next time, I'd go to Dodger games to kind of get stuff for my column. And Big D says, Larry, I saw what you wrote. Don't ever write that again. So he was pretty sensitive about that, but he sure bent my ear about his desire to get more airtime, and by doing that is being the full-time commentator. Yeah. And Vin was very comfortable, and rightfully so. And with his style, it wouldn't have worked with a commentator. But when he was forced to work with Joe Garagiola at NBC, there was a columnist in Boston, Jack Craig, Boston writers never missed an opportunity to rip on LA people. And he said there wasn't enough room in the broadcast booth for the egos of Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola. And as you read in the book, that didn't set well with Vin. And so when I broached the idea of a two-announcer format, as you read in the book, I heard the Dodger beat writer at the Times, I think it was Richard Hoffer, says, Scully's mad at you. And I thought, mad? Vin isn't mad. I've never seen. And so I called Steve Brenner, and he goes, yeah, he's pretty upset. And I said, well, you think I should call him? And Brenner says, that's up to you. And Dodgers were in San Diego, and I think Brenner gave me the phone number of the hotel, and Vin picked up the phone, and I just thought, I'd say, Vin, I understand you were upset about the column last week. And I thought, Larry, it bothered me a little bit, but he was upset. He was really upset. And I was kind of shocked. But a couple of months later, toward the end of the season, I think I praised the work of him and Garagiola or something. I got a full-blown letter explaining the whole situation that, and it made me realize he was upset about the Jack Craig column in the Boston Globe more than, and he actually read what I was saying, what Craig had written. He thought I was implying that. And he says, you've insulted Ross Porter, you've insulted Jerry Doggett, you've insulted every person who I've ever worked with. And I thought, whoa. But after that letter, our relationship went back to the way it was. I write in the book, it really bothered me. I didn't sleep for a few nights. It was like a girlfriend had broken up with me. I mean, here this icon was, he told me, you and I have had our last conversation, but he's such a classy person. He could have said, I don't need this guy. I've got my job, I'm set. But he took the time. He didn't say, I'm sorry, but he explained the way he said it. Thanks for the kind words. Considered we crossed swords earlier in the season, and it was all forgotten. And one of my editors, who is from Chicago, he was a Jack Brickhouse guy, and I said, "Gee, I just talked to Scully, and he's really upset with it." He's like, "Write it," and that would be career suicide to take on Vince Scully in LA. I could have gotten away with criticizing you, but never Vin.
No, Larry, you chronicled your frustration in the book when you said, when Bill Shirley, and he was the sports editor of the LA Times at the time, when Bill Shirley hired me, I pitched the idea of me doing a weekly TV radio column. I cited stories that the Times underplayed because the paper didn't have anyone covering sports broadcasting. One example I used was when Ross Porter, a prominent, thank you very much, Larry, a prominent sports anchor for KNBC Channel 4, was hired as a Dodger announcer in 1977. I did a full column for the Herald Examiner, while the Times had one sentence under the heading "Names in the News" in the newspaper column. Shirley was not swayed. He turned down my pitch and said, "We don't want to glorify the competition."
So fortunately, Bill Dwyer came to the Times in '81 and sure changed things for me. I was writing on my own time, and actually, Bill Shirley and I got along. I'd met him, but we spent some time during an ABC junket to Montreal about a month before the 1976 Olympics in Montreal, and we got along. We would be on a bus to one of the sites, and he would come and sit down next to me, or we would be at a meal. And it got so, I think on our last night, we were at a very fancy restaurant, and Bill Shirley and I were just talking, and he was a good conversationalist and easygoing guy in that situation. And Jim McKay, the Olympic host, came up to the two of us and said, "Gee, I never know you two work for competing newspapers. You seem to be joined at the hip." And Shirley kind of wandered off and went and sat over with some other people that night. But I don't think without that junket and him getting to know me, he would have ever hired me in 1978. And so I think personally he liked me, but he couldn't believe when people would say, "Well, we think the Herald Examiner sports section is better than the Times." That would just drive. There were people that said that. And I understood that the Times was a bigger section, better edited, more complete, more organized, but the writers at the Herald had more freedom and a little bit more fun. And when Bud Furlow was the sports editor, he was a great newspaper man, and he had some of these crazy ideas. And the Herald was more fun, but journalistically speaking, there was fewer typos in the LA Times. But I think he told John Hall, who was pushing me to do a TV column, in his Southern drawl, he was from Arkansas. Bill Shirley said, "Well, Larry Stewart may be good enough to write for the Herald Examiner. He's not good enough to write regularly for the LA Times." So I knew I was up against it, but then everything worked out. So I did get some writing assignments from him, but I was mostly writing on my own time. And after that, I just says, oh, it's not doing me any good to do these stories on my, here, he gave me huge play. I wrote a long expose on the future of sports on cable television. And back then, it was made, the crux of the story was an interview with Ted Turner, who started broadcasting Braves games across the country on WTBS. And while I was researching that story, that was in 1979, I got a tip to talk to somebody from Getty Oil. There was this father and son, Bill and Scott Rasmussen in Connecticut. They had this crazy idea of a 24-hour channel of nothing but sports. And I go, what? That's impossible. And so I did talk to Bill Rasmussen. I got a hold of him and listened to this crazy idea. It was going to be called the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network. And they were going to use entertainment because they didn't think they could fill one channel with enough sports. They were going to have to play some old movies late at night. And so the original name of ESPN was Entertainment and Sports Programming Network. And then ESPN decided we're better recognized as ESPN. But newspapers like the New York Times, where our style is, we spell everything out. And so that was about 1983. ESPN officially changed their name to ESPN.
Yeah.
The letters don't mean anything. It's
No.
just ESPN.
You were let go in 2008 after 39 years on newspapers in Los Angeles. Larry, I admire what you said in the book. I never felt depressed about losing my dream job. How did you achieve that feeling?
Well, there was a couple of reasons for that. One is the newspaper business was starting on its downhill slide. And it wasn't the same paper it was during when Bill Dwyer was the sports editor. Even when Bill Shirley was there, the first time I made a trip for Bill Shirley was to cover the big game, Stanford Cal, at Berkeley. And I found out Times reporters always flew first class, could stay at any hotel of their choosing. It didn't matter what it cost. Could get up to $500 a day cash advance. They had to account for it, but and we all had business credit cards that we were encouraged to use, and those days were behind me. And so I took it to be, okay, I've had a great run. When I got laid off, 350 people got laid off that day, 14 in sports.
Wow.
And I say, okay, it wasn't me. We move on to something else. And I thought I would get depressed, but I think because the job was going downhill, it didn't really bother me that much. It really didn't. And I kind of welcomed some new challenges. I now freelance for the Southern California News Group. So I still do some reporting. I did during the pandemic, but between my charity work and freelancing and writing a book, my life is still pretty full. And getting to talk to people like you makes every day pretty good.
Thank you.
Got to come to your golf tournament, though.
Oh, yeah. As you say, you're now a freelance journalist. I saw one of your bylines a few days ago, and you're working really kind of as a charity consultant, aren't you? I mean, you help the charities put on these celebrity golf tournaments. Tell us about that.
Well, I'm trying to think how it started. Our oldest daughter is mentally challenged to a somewhat minor degree. And she has some challenges, but she lives on her own and does pretty well. And she was working for a company. She's a very good typist. Bob Graziano hired her to do a project and was just thrilled with her.
Former president of the Dodgers.
Yeah. And after he was no longer at the Dodgers, but she was working for a company and the woman ran a food bank. And so I helped her with her charity. And Jerry West came and James Worthy and Bill Sharman came several times, and Steve Garvey and Bill Russell and Ron Say and Al Downing, Gentleman Al Downing. If there was ever a nickname for somebody that fits, it is Gentleman Al Downing.
Yeah.
And so I got a pretty good lineup of celebrities for them over several years. And then Bill Sharman's widow introduced me to the charity out in Northridge that I found for a year or two. I was doing 2 golf tournaments in 1 year, and that's pretty hard to do.
Yes,
You know, as a volunteer basis, you can't keep going back to the same people. It's like the charity that you get, that you donate, and now they start, and I didn't want to be the person. Well, you came to this turn. Well, I got another one. So I've really cut back. And then because of the pandemic, this one charity hasn't had a golf tournament. But I think I brought in both cases, I took their golf tournament to another level.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Tell everybody the best way to get your book.
Well, it's available on Amazon, and I've had a few problems. There are 4 editions, well, 5. It is available in ebooks, and actually that's done pretty well. But I had a young man who helped me publish it, and we had a lot of problems with the ebook. And finally, the pictures putting pictures in the book was difficult. We couldn't get captions to line up, so I eliminated the captions separately and put the photo information in the text right next to the pictures. And when you read the book, you probably noticed that.
It's easy.
And that worked pretty well. But for the ebook, I took out all the pictures because we couldn't figure out. It was a mess.
So what do you advise then that people look for and buy?
I'm kind of explaining that there was some difficulty, but right now the book I unpublished, this is a paperback. It's also available in hardcover with color pictures. It was also available hardcover and paperback with black and white pictures. But I noticed almost nobody was buying the hardcover with black and white pictures. And not too many are buying the hardcover with color because Amazon set the price at $46.99. And that's kind of embarrassing. But I found some people actually were willing to spend that. But I recommend the paperback, which is $25.99 with the color pictures. You can get the black and white, the paperback with black and white pictures for $15.99. But I unpublished the hardcover with black and white because almost nobody was buying that. And Amazon does things and moves things around. And so it would put the hardcover with color pictures and the paperback with black and white. All this leads up to no, there are different versions, and there's a way to see all editions. But keep in mind, when you go, if you just Google Larry Stewart, my up close view, you're going to find it. You may have to check several places, but I recommend you buy the paperback for $25.99 with color pictures. And I'm going into this long, involved story because people have called me and said, gee, but all I see here is the paperback with black and white. And I'll say, keep looking, you'll find it. But people that order books online kind of know what they're doing. And so it's easy to find. It was published by Amazon, but we self-published it. And they promoted it. You know, a few people have written reviews. Nobody's given it anything less than a 5-star so far. Last I checked. But they can go to Amazon.com or they can just Google Larry Stewart, my up close view. And I'm just saying, if you can't find the paperback, and that's what you want, the paperback color pictures, just search around, they'll find it.
Larry, this has been such an enjoyable conversation. Stay well, my friend, and thank you for taking the time to be with
Okay,
us.
I'd like to talk to you off when we get done here too, off the air for a minute.
Well, okay, and I will not ask my agent, my wife Lynn, to come in and negotiate whatever you have to say. But thanks, Larry. It was great.
Yeah, I've got the door closed on my office so we wouldn't get interrupted or anything.
Thank
So
you.
I've enjoyed this. It's been a pleasure and an honor. It's just another little thing in my life that's kind of interesting, writing a book and promoting it and having you do a video on it. And I think back to that column that I wrote, which was a big story when you got hired by the Dodgers.
Yeah, that's right.
After being a prominent sports anchor. Remember that word, prominent.
Thank you, sir. See you soon. Thank you.
Okay.